The millionaire slammed his hand on the table in fury when 3 interpreters failed to understand him, until a waitress calmly set down her tray, stepped forward and said, "Let me." In that instant, the entire room fell silent. No one knew that very moment would change the fate of them both, forever. Watch until the end to see how a waitress managed to silence one of the most powerful men in the room. I've said it 3 times, and still no one understands me. The man's deep, heavy voice burst against the rim of his glass and echoed through the room like compressed thunder. Beneath the chandelier of the Grand Manhattan Conference Hall, Michael Reed sat at the head of Table 9, black-tailored suit hugging his shoulders, a thin rose-gold watch gleaming on his wrist, clean-shaven jawline, sharp and cold. His dark brown eyes, the kind that belonged to men who made decisions, not requests, swept across the faces before him like a metal scanner. He barely needed to move. A single tilt of his chin could silence an entire table. The white tablecloth was smooth as glass, knives and forks lined up in perfect symmetry. The scent of Arabica coffee mixed with mint tea lingered in the air. The air conditioner hummed evenly, brushing through the heavy grey drapes. 3 interpreters sat to his left. The first had already given up. The second clutched his notes, eyes bloodshot. The third's hands trembled as he set down his microphone. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't convey the full nuance of your words," one finally rasped. Michael leaned forward. "Can't or won't?" An American investor whispered to his partner. "If we don't close today, the cash flow's frozen another quarter." A Frenchman frowned. "What language is he even speaking?" The sounds bled together, thin, like dust on glass. Then a spoon hit the floor, clean, sharp, and every head turned toward the corner. Rebecca Carter bent to pick it up. She was about 26, slender but steady. Her black and white uniform fit neatly, sleeves folded at the wrist. Her brown hair was tied low, a few damp strands clinging to her neck. Her hands were tanned, fingertips faintly calloused from washing glasses. A thin scar like a thread crossed the middle joint of her right index finger. Chestnut eyes, direct, unflinching. A trace of lemon soap followed her as she straightened up and smoothed her apron, a reflex to hide her quickened breath. She stood the way people do when they've trained themselves to count heartbeats before speaking. Michael's gaze cut toward her like a blade through fabric. "What did you spill?" At least, learn to stand still when someone's speaking. She pressed her lips together, didn't argue. Her manager behind her gestured for her to step back. Rebecca obeyed, half a step only, tray still in hand. From the head of the table, Michael added, his voice low and metallic, "Anyone who doesn't understand the language of conviction will never understand people." And then he switched languages. Not the English he used daily, but Swiss German, Schweizerdeutsch, a clipped swallowed dialect dense with metaphors, unfamiliar to all but native speakers. He uttered a proverb, "Das Wort ist Pfand," a word is a pledge to be kept. The 3 interpreters exchanged helpless looks. 2 couldn't even catch the rhythm. The third knew High German, but lost track amid the swallowed syllables and Zurich idioms. The phrase flicked a switch in Rebecca's memory. The smell of old paper, her father's slow voice reading Rilke. She'd studied linguistics at CUNY before dropping out, spent a semester abroad in Zurich, and once worked night shifts at a family cafe, listening to and speaking Swiss German for months. She didn't exactly hesitate, she simply inhaled and held it 1 beat longer. The tension thickened. The wall clock ticked, each sound distinct. The third interpreter excused himself. The American investor kept sipping water. A server replaced the mint teapot, hands slightly shaking. The security guard by the door adjusted his earpiece, the red light flickering. Everyone was busy with their own unease, except Michael, who sat still, tendons at his wrist tightening as he turned his glass. An American partner leaned forward, speaking just loud enough for 3 others to hear. "This can't go on. We're losing time." And face. Rebecca heard every word. Her eyes stayed on the tray until her fingers stopped at the table's edge. Her knuckles whitened from the grip. She set the tray down carefully, wiped away a ring of condensation, then stepped forward once. Her voice was calm, not loud, but clear. "Let me." The air froze, as if the power had been cut. The manager gasped, too late to pull the words back. Michael turned sharply. Light carved a sharp line across his cheekbone. "What did you just say?" Rebecca lifted her head, arms at her sides, shoulders square. "I can translate Schweizerdeutsch for you, if you'll allow me." A few quiet laughs flickered around the table. A photojournalist lowered his camera. Even the hum of the air conditioner sounded like wind slipping through a door crack. Michael crossed his arms. His cufflinks clicked softly. His gaze traveled from her crisp collar to the apron seams, down to the worn shoes, every detail speaking of a life bound by discipline and thrift. Then he let out a short, humorless laugh. "You? A woman in an apron?" Rebecca didn't flinch. Her lips moved just slightly. Even a woman in an apron can understand the language of honor. A faint line flickered across the corner of Michael's eye, the only sign of surprise. He was silent for a few seconds, as if weighing the exact weight of what he'd just heard. Then he gave a slight nod. "Go on." Rebecca took half a step forward so the microphone could catch her voice. She didn't look at him, nor at the audience. Her gaze rested on the empty space above the table, where the light reflected off the lamp's shade. When she spoke, her voice was round and steady, her rhythm sure, like someone quietly tapping a foot beneath the table. "Mr. Reed just said, 'S Wort ish a Pfand.' A word is a debt to be kept. In our business culture, a promise is the foundation of cooperation. Not numbers, but integrity." He was simply reminding us of that. The American investor looked up. The furrow on his brow eased slightly. The Frenchman stopped twirling his pen. From the head of the table, Michael dropped another metaphor in Schweizerdeutsch, something about scarcity and the keeper of resources. Rebecca didn't translate word for word. She interpreted. In times of scarcity, the one who keeps faith is worth more than the one who counts the most money. That's the message. An Italian executive leaned over and whispered, "She just turned a threat into a philosophy." Rebecca continued, her tone even. Her hands opened and closed with each idea, like someone counting her own pulse. The sharp scent of mint softened. No one tapped their pens anymore. A waiter slowed his paw to match the rhythm of her voice. Michael no longer looked at the room. He looked at her. His jaw had softened. The vein on his wrist seemed to slow its pulse. His next words carried less edge. The meeting ended without applause or fanfare. Chairs slid back, shoes brushed against carpet, papers folded neatly. No one mentioned leaving. One American partner, while shaking hands, spoke just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "Keep her. She helps us understand you." Michael didn't answer. He lifted his glass, but didn't drink. In the reflection of the rim, Rebecca's figure appeared, gathering knives and forks into straight lines, leaning slightly as she wiped a small water stain from the table. Her movements were meticulous, like someone folding away a day's work, flat, clean, leaving no trace. Her face caught the light. High cheekbones, fine lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting at menus. Composed, like someone who had learned how to stand still in the noise. The manager approached, bowing slightly. "Sir, about the incident. We'd like to apologize." "What's her name?" Michael interrupted. "Rebecca Carter, sir. We're temporary staff." He nodded once. The light drew a thin golden edge along his shoulder. From now on, she won't be serving tables. She'll work for me." The manager froze. "But sir, she doesn't have an official interpreter's record, and I didn't ask for her record," Michael said evenly, his voice firm. "I said she'll work for me." At the far end of the room, Rebecca's hands stopped. The tray slid slightly across the table, making a faint metallic chime, like a misplaced note. She looked up. Their eyes met, not as commander and subordinate, but as two people who had just recognized the same anchor within a sentence. Michael lowered his glass. A single drop spilled over the rim, rolled across the polished wood, and stopped exactly where Rebecca had bent earlier to pick up a spoon. The ring it left spread thin, round, then disappeared, and she had no idea that by the next morning her life would turn down a slope with no return. The next morning, the sky above the Grand Manhattan Hotel was clearer than ever, but inside the kitchen, the air felt unusually still. Rebecca arrived early, as always. She boiled water, arranged napkins, polished silverware, each motion precise, practiced. Only her eyes were different, deeper, as if they had just glimpsed the edge of pride itself. While she was replacing the water bottles for late guests, John, the morning shift manager, walked in, holding an envelope stamped with the Reed Industries logo. His voice was flat. "Miss Rebecca Carter." In my office, Rebecca felt her heart race as she stepped into the small manager's office. Sunlight from the window cast a pale white streak across the glass desk. John set the invitation down without looking at her. "From Michael Reed's office. Seems he wants to see you." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside was a printed note in bold. "Mr. Michael Reed requests the presence of Miss Rebecca Carter at the chairman's office, 48th floor, at 9 a.m. Formal attire required." John raised an eyebrow, his smile crooked. "I don't know what you said to make him notice, but try not to drag the whole restaurant down with you." A cook from behind the door chimed in. "You think he's calling her up there to repeat what she said yesterday?" "Go on, let's see." Another voice scoffed. "Or maybe he just wants to give her a proper scolding before firing her." "Sounds right." The laughter that followed was cold. Rebecca smiled faintly, folded the envelope, and murmured dreamily, "I'll go." She turned away, each step deliberate, as if she were tying a safety line around her heart. That evening, in her small room beside the staff quarters, the round water stain from the night before was still faintly visible on the floor. Rebecca wiped it again, closing one chapter. She pulled out her old suit, faintly smelling of tobacco, ironed it quickly, adjusted her outfit with care. Standing before the mirror, she looked at herself, a perfectly ordinary woman, but with eyes ready to walk straight into danger. She whispered to her reflection, "If they call, I'll go. Whatever the reason, at least I'll know the truth." Floor 48. The large wooden door bore the engraved name, Michael Reed. Rebecca took a deep breath and knocked 3 times, softly. "Come in." Michael Reed sat behind his desk, sunlight cutting through the glass wall and casting a cold streak across his cheek. He hadn't looked at her yet, only flipping through a few pages on the desk. "You're 2 minutes late." "The elevator stopped on the 30th floor, sir," Rebecca replied calmly. "I didn't ask for a reason. I asked if you understand who you're standing in front of." "I do," she said, her voice steady. "A man who can silence an entire room with just a glance." Michael Reed gave a faint smile, a quick curve at the corner of his lips. "Good. Then you understand I don't summon people up here to show gratitude." He gestured lightly. A secretary hurried over, handed him a thick folder, then stepped back. Michael fixed his gaze on Rebecca. "I need someone who understands not just the words I speak, but the way I think. Someone who can translate my intent without letting anyone twist it. Rebecca froze. You want me to be your interpreter? She asked softly. Something like that, Michael shrugged. I don't have any formal qualifications, sir, she admitted. Michael narrowed his eyes, letting out a quiet laugh. Not mocking, but razor sharp. You've already silenced 4 professional interpreters. Don't diminish yourself by talking about degrees. But I'm just a waitress. I don't want people to think I'm looking for shortcuts. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. Michael walked slowly toward the window, his tone lower now, tinged with fatigue. Do you think I chose you out of pity? Not at all. I chose you because you said what no one else dared to. Rebecca stopped, looking at him. In Michael's eyes flickered a rare kind of surprise. Not from power, but from curiosity. He turned back, his voice soft. I've heard too many flattering words. You were the first to challenge me, in my own language. Rebecca smiled, controlled yet firm. Aren't you afraid I might misunderstand you? If you had the courage to speak up to me in front of a crowd, you have the strength to understand me correctly. Something in his tone made her heartbeat stumble. Not from intimidation, but from genuine acknowledgement. I'm not sure I'm ready for the position you're offering, she hesitated. Michael stepped closer, his presence carrying conviction. No one is ever truly ready for a chance that changes their life, Rebecca. But when it knocks, you only have 2 options: open the door or regret it. He paused, lowering his voice. Think of it this way. You're not working for me. You're preserving the meaning of words, keeping them from being distorted. The afternoon light reflected in Rebecca's eyes. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll try. Michael nodded, satisfied. He handed her a pair of folders. Good. You start tomorrow. Geneva, Energy Conference. Be ready. Rebecca straightened, holding the folders tightly, her eyes sharp. If I fail, you can send me back to the kitchen. If you fail, Michael said slowly, at least I'll know you had the courage to try. The air grew dense. Rebecca bowed slightly, turned, and walked toward the door. Just as she stepped out, his voice echoed behind her. Rebecca! She stopped. Yes, sir? I hate people who talk too much. But I respect those who speak at the right moment. A brief smile crossed his lips, a quiet sign of admiration. The door closed behind her, opening a new chapter in her life, one she didn't yet realize would be irreversible. Rebecca left the room. The hallway was so still that each step sounded foreign. She pressed the elevator button. When the doors opened on the ground floor, the polished tiles gleamed beneath her shoes. But today, she didn't walk back to the service counter. Her co-workers glanced her way, some surprised, others whispering. Tara, the blonde receptionist, smirked. Oh, she's back. Tell us, what's so mysterious about the 48th floor? Coffee or contracts? Laughter rippled through the group. Another server chimed in. Maybe he offered her a personal assistant job. Happens all the time, Rebecca stayed silent, removed her gloves, and folded them neatly into her bag. Her quietness only fueled their jabs. Or maybe she got yelled at. Mr. Reed doesn't apologize to anyone, Tara said sweetly, dripping with mockery. Everyone froze when Paul, the floor manager, stepped out, pretending to be casual. If she really met him, she'd be fired by now. Rebecca lifted her head, calm and composed. You're right. The room fell silent. She placed her employee badge on the counter, its front reading Rebecca Carter, waitress, then raised her chin. I'm resigning. As of today, Paul's eyes widened. What? Where do you think you're going? No one's going to hire someone like you. Rebecca smiled faintly. I'll find my own way. Tara burst out laughing. Find your own way? Sure. Maybe in Mr. Reed's dreams, ChatGPT John Noy. The air grew heavy. An older waitress, her silhouette framed in the corner of the kitchen, Ivy, a long-time server, leaned closer and said softly, "Go, sweetheart. Don't let anyone make you think you're smaller than you are." Rebecca bowed her head in gratitude and didn't look back. She quietly took her coat and bag, walking out of the restaurant. No one saw her off. Outside, under the afternoon sun, her shadow stretched long across the asphalt. From this moment on, every step she took would be steady, because she had chosen to follow her own voice. Beyond the street, a black sedan stopped in front of the apartment building, silent as the night itself. A driver in a suit stepped out, holding an envelope embossed with the Reed Industries logo. And from here, Rebecca Carter's real journey began. The elevator doors slid open into the lobby. Rebecca stepped out, the chill of the steel still on her skin. The guard straightened up. A black Mercedes S-Class glided up to the steps, as if time itself had been waiting. The driver opened the rear door and bowed. A few restaurant employees changing shifts stared wide-eyed when they saw Rebecca, a new temporary badge pinned to her lapel, a folder of documents in her arms. She got into the back seat. The leather seat cradled her back, the scent of wood and warm leather, a world away from the lemon and soap of her night shifts. Michael Reed was already inside, a file open across his lap. He skimmed the printed lines and spoke in an even tone. "You studied linguistics at CUNY, took an exchange semester in Zurich, dropped out your final year. Why stop?" Rebecca looked out the window, her reflection merging with the retreating buildings. "My father was falsely accused. We had to leave New York for a while. I started working to support my family." For half a minute, the only sound in the car was the soft glide of the tires. Michael didn't ask further. He watched the road ahead, as if mapping every intersection in his mind. She understood. Some things didn't need long explanations. The car stopped before Reed Industries' Midtown headquarters. The grand lobby caught the light, security staff moving with an invisible rhythm. Rebecca followed Michael straight to the 48th floor. The doors opened. The board was already seated. Leather chairs, fixed microphones, all waiting for the man who had just entered. Victor Kane stood by the screen, wearing a polite smile. "This is Mr. Reed's new language consultant." A female executive raised an eyebrow, letting out a small laugh. "She's the coffee girl." Rebecca set her briefcase on the chair beside her and replied calmly, "I serve when needed. But today, I'm here to translate and clarify meaning." Michael pulled out his chair and sat. The air shifted with that single motion. He placed a thick contract on the table and slid it toward Rebecca. "Translate this for me," he said, "as if you're the only one in this room who'll be held responsible if it's wrong." She opened it. Paragraphs of legal text overlapped with financial jargon, annotated with short notes in German and English. Rebecca read quickly, locking onto the phrasing, reconstructing meaning in her head. When she spoke, her voice was low and steady. "The contract links credit limits to progress milestones, requires an independent oversight mechanism, and adds an ethical clause on local hiring. The intent is collaboration, not bargaining." A European director stopped twirling his pen. Victor stayed still, his smile unchanged. Rebecca turned the next page and paused at the word stakeholders. She looked around the table and said, "In this context, translating stakeholders as interested parties is technically correct, but cold. I suggest those who carry expectations. It keeps the spirit of community engagement this clause is aiming for." The room went silent, not from admiration, but because everyone was weighing how a single word could alter an approach. Michael tilted his head, the first sign he was truly listening. "Go on," he said. Rebecca continued through the key sections, restructuring sentences to highlight just enough risk without triggering defensiveness. She avoided grandiose phrasing. She used working verbs: implement, coordinate, verify, amend. Occasionally, Michael dropped a short phrase in Schweizerdeutsch. She caught it, interpreted the intent rather than the words, returning meaning instead of translation. Her delivery was so fluid that some had forgotten to question why the waitress was sitting there at all. When she finished, Michael tapped his pen lightly against the table. Once. "Good." He turned to the board. "Incorporate that phrasing into the report. Send the revised draft to the European side this afternoon." A director started to ask why, but Michael had already glanced toward Rebecca. "Send her the old version. She'll revise it entirely, according to her proposal." Rebecca nodded. She knew he'd just laid a brick. If she failed, that brick would be the first crack. If she succeeded, it would be the foundation. The meeting paused for 10 minutes. Rebecca stepped into the hallway, leaning against the glass wall, exhaling deeply. The city below shrank into a mosaic of blocks. A light hand touched her shoulder. Miriam, the communications director, short-haired, holding a tablet. "In this place," Miriam said quietly, "they don't forgive intelligence. But keep doing what you did today, ChatGPT Janoi." Rebecca smiled faintly. "I only said what I believe is true." Miriam nodded. "Then remember this. Being right isn't enough. Being clear is." She handed over a business card. "Call me if you need anything." Rebecca slipped the card into her jacket pocket, her fingers brushing against the edge of her employee badge. Inside the room, chairs scraped and microphones clicked back on. 10 minutes were up. She turned to go back in, steadying her breath. The rest of the meeting passed in procedure: task assignments, deadlines, accountability charts. Rebecca took quick, neat notes. Each time Michael paused mid-sentence, she already knew where to pick it up. Victor stood by the screen, occasionally leaning toward an assistant to whisper something too soft to catch. Only at the end, when everyone stood, did his eyes slide over Rebecca, as if pinning an invisible mark on her shoulder. Outside, she ran into Miriam again by the water cooler. "Be careful with some people's silence," Miriam said without looking at her. "Silence around here usually means something." "I understand," Rebecca replied. And she did. Silence was a language too. Meanwhile, in a glass office across the hall, Victor stood beside his young assistant. The ceiling lights reflected off the glass, casting half his face in pale blue. "Start monitoring every email she sends," Victor said slowly, each word measured. "I want to know how smart she really is." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, if IT notices—" "Flag it as a security concern," Victor interrupted, his smile returning. "We're all about cybersecurity, aren't we?" The assistant nodded and stepped out. Victor stayed, staring through the tinted glass. Across the hall, Rebecca was speaking with Miriam, nodding before heading toward the elevator with her briefcase. As the doors closed, the glass caught his reflection, half lit, half swallowed by blue light. In his eyes, a new spark appeared, not surprise, but calculation. High above, a security camera captured the image and saved a single unnoticed frame. A small, cold dot, waiting for its next line. The elevator doors opened into the late-night quiet. Rebecca carried her briefcase back to the 48th floor to finish signing the last pages of the translation draft. The hallway was empty. Motion lights flicked on one by one with each step, their soft glow rippling along the glass like a thin current of water. In the print room, the machine still hummed steadily, feeding out pages marked with faint pencil traces. Rebecca gathered them, stapled the stack neatly, took a deep breath to stay alert, and pushed open the main office door. Michael Reed was still there, jacket draped over his chair, shirt sleeves rolled, tie loosened. The bluish light from his laptop cast sharp relief across his tired jawline. He looked like a man holding a drawn bowstring, silent but ready to move. "Tomorrow's the main negotiation," he said, without looking up from the papers. "They'll test if you're afraid." "I'm only afraid of what I don't understand." Michael tapped his fingers lightly on the desk. "Then you'll learn fast." The desk lamp spread a warm gold across the papers. Rebecca's handwriting was firm and even. She pointed to a note. "I drafted 2 translation options. 1 direct, 1 diplomatic. Your choice." Diplomatic. It lets them save face. Sometimes a softer line goes further. Michael looked up. His eyes softened noticeably. He closed his laptop and leaned back against the desk. "You work well, but you still don't know when to stop." "Neither do you." For the first time he laughed, quietly, not coldly, just a breath finally released. "Cars at 6. Get some sleep." Rebecca nodded. As she pushed the door open, their eyes met through the glass, between a man used to giving orders and a woman who never bowed her head. The door closed. Michael stayed where he was, watching her reflection fade away. And in that brief moment, he realized he trusted his intuition more than any number. The next morning, Geneva was wrapped in a veil of mist, fine as salt. The air was cool enough to sting the skin. The Reed Industries delegation entered the conference center, black suits blending into the grey walls. Rebecca tested the microphone, warmed up her voice, accepted a bottle of water from her assistant, and went over the final annotations one last time. A French partner leaned toward his colleague and murmured, quiet enough to sound harmless. "Did Mr. Reed hire a waitress to translate for him?" She heard it clearly, but didn't react. Michael sat at the head of the table and gave a small nod, a signal. "Go ahead." Rebecca stood upright, translated his words into French, and then deliberately closed the opening statement with a line she'd chosen with care. "Dans un marché asséché, celui qui tient la confiance tient l'avenir, peu importe le costume qu'il porte. In a dry market, whoever holds trust holds the future, no matter what they wear." A pause followed, just long enough for the meaning to settle into the room. Then pens began to move. The French partner looked at her and gave a slight nod, as if he now understood the tone of today's meeting. At the head of the table, Michael restrained a faint smile. He knew her word choice was no accident. When the discussion reached sensitive terms, Rebecca translated briefly and precisely, stripping away words that could trigger defensive reactions. She turned language into a bridge. Each sentence she rendered was like placing a flat stone on water, wide enough for both sides to step across. When Michael dropped a few phrases in Schweizerdeutsch, rough but humorous imagery, she didn't translate word for word. She translated intent, giving back the rhythm of thought instead of just its sound. The pace held steady. The note-taker stopped fidgeting. The air warmed as if someone had cracked a window open. The meeting ended neatly. No applause, no ceremony. As people spilled into the hallway, Miriam approached, tablet tucked under her arm. "You just made them see Mr. Reed differently." "I only wanted them to understand each other." "Winning isn't the goal." "Here, understanding is winning," Miriam said with a smile, tapping her shoulder before heading back to the communications team. Not far away, Michael stood by a column, saying nothing. His gaze had softened, carrying a quiet surprise, not because she was clever, but because she truly believed what she'd said. By late afternoon, the schedule pushed Rebecca back to the hotel with the team, where coffee and updated cost charts awaited in the temporary meeting room. Victor Kane opened his slide deck, his voice flat and measured. The independent audit costs are up 30%. The partners are reacting too quickly to internal updates. Someone's leaking data. Michael looked up. Who do you suspect? Victor didn't look at Rebecca, but guided his words the way he wanted them to land. Someone new. Someone saying exactly what others want to hear. Miriam glanced at Rebecca, then at Michael, a silent question passing between them. No one spoke. Michael closed his folder, signaled to move on, and the meeting ended a few minutes early. A short silence, left hanging, too heavy to touch. Evening came before anyone realized the day was gone. Wind from the lake drummed against the hotel roof like a slow metronome. Rebecca stepped out onto the terrace to call home. She told her mother only what was necessary. The interpretation went fine. The weather was cold, but beautiful. No need to worry. On the other end, her mother reminded her to eat properly and not stay up too late. The same words repeated over the years, yet still strong enough to keep a person steady. Just as Rebecca hung up, the terrace door opened. Victor appeared in a grey coat, his polite smile perfectly measured. "Every call here is recorded," he said smoothly. "Be careful." Rebecca looked at him for exactly one beat, said nothing. She placed a hand on the railing, eyes on the lake, black and still as forged steel. A church bell rang 3 times in the distance, then fell silent. Was that a warning, or a velvet-wrapped threat? She couldn't tell, but it was enough to remind herself. From now on, every word she spoke would have to balance truth against safety. On her way back through the hallway, she passed the corner suite, its lights off. Through the glass, Michael stood motionless, his back to the window, city lights tracing a pale line across his cheek. He looked as if he was still listening to the echo of the meeting. As Rebecca walked by, the glass caught both reflections, hers in motion, his still. His eyes paused briefly on her mirrored image, then turned back into the dark of the room. In that instant, trust had just been laid on the table, and almost at the same time, doubt quietly pulled up a chair. The next morning, the same window that had mirrored them both now reflected a bold headline: "Reed Industries changes the game in Europe." Miriam set the fresh ink newspaper on Michael Reed's desk. "See?" she said crisply. "The public loves this new image." Michael turned the page, scanning the excerpts quickly. He didn't smile, nor did he show satisfaction. From the corner, Victor Kane walked in, holding the updated cost sheet. He placed it next to the paper. "But sometimes an image is built on sand," he said lightly, as if commenting on the weather. "One small gust is all it takes." Michael looked up, meeting his eyes. "Say it plainly. What are you warning me about?" Victor unfolded the sheet. Rising audit costs, unusually quick partner responses, small irregularities scattered through the data. "I'm saying, if someone's been leaking minor details, they'll always be one step ahead." "Who do you suspect?" Michael asked again, eyes still on the numbers. Victor didn't answer directly. Instead, he lifted the newspaper and tapped the line mentioning community engagement strategy. "When someone says exactly what others want to hear," he said, "it's often because they've already said it to someone else first." Miriam crossed her arms, looking at him over the rim of her glasses. "Don't be cryptic." "We're talking about security," Victor replied, still as polite as ever. "I'll handle it." Michael folded the newspaper shut, the sound of paper hitting the desk sharp as a period. "Do it." The IT room downstairs was cold and smelled of new plastic. Rows of servers hummed in steady rhythm. Victor stepped in and closed the door. A young technician shot up from his chair, stepping aside, his eyes darting briefly toward the ceiling camera. "I need you," Victor said quietly, "to send a copy of the project files to this address." He slid a small slip of paper forward. An unfamiliar email address. Use Rebecca's account. The technician froze. But that's her personal email. That's against protocol. Who said it was wrong? Victor's smile was thin. We're testing security. If the system can't handle a small push, it'll collapse tomorrow. He placed a slim envelope on the desk, sliding it gently forward. The IT department's due for an upgrade. I think you understand priorities. The door shut behind him. Inside, only the fan's hum and the hesitant clatter of keys remained, like the start of a countdown clock. That afternoon, Michael was signing a batch of transfer documents when his phone buzzed. The head of internal security spoke with surgical precision. Confidential files have been leaked. The trail leads through the company email. Michael straightened. Who was the last to access them? Rebecca Carter. The room froze. Miriam looked up from her screen, blinking once. Victor said nothing, just shifted a step closer, as if to hear better. Michael tightened his grip on the pen, then set it down and stood. Call her in. Rebecca entered, still holding the edited report from that morning. The room was so silent, they could hear the hallway draft brushing past the door. Miriam stood by the window. Victor waited behind her. Michael sat at his desk, his shadow stretching long across the wood. No one spoke until Michael threw a printed email onto the desk. The pages slid, stopping right at Rebecca's feet. Explain this. Rebecca looked down. The subject line, the sender, the attachment. She scanned quickly, then stopped. Her face went pale, her voice small but steady. It wasn't me. Michael didn't raise his voice. His tone stayed level, but it pressed the air tighter around them. Every traitor starts with those words. Miriam's lips parted, then closed again. Victor stood slightly to the side, the light glinting off his glasses, splitting his face in half, one side bright, the other in shadow. Rebecca laid the paper down and lifted her head. No tears, no trembling. If I were a traitor, I wouldn't be standing here. A long silence followed. Michael circled the desk, stopping right in front of her. The light reflected in his eyes like twin shards of metal. He stared at her for a long time, as if searching for cracks in a trust newly built. Then he turned away, his voice flat as still water. Revoke her access. As of today, she's off the team. The words landed clean and cold. Security entered on cue. Rebecca didn't move, her hand clenched around her ID badge until the pin pressed into her skin. She took it off, placed it carefully on the desk, and pushed it forward so it wouldn't fall. Miriam exhaled softly, about to speak, but Victor touched her elbow, a quiet warning. His voice dropped, thin as a drawn wire. This is politics, not justice. Rebecca turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused for half a second. She didn't turn fully, just tilted her head, enough for the light to fall across half her face. Her eyes found Michael's. No anger, no pleading, just a still, deep gaze, like water before a storm, the kind that said more than any defense could. You just lost the only person who never lied to you. Michael stood motionless. For a brief instant, his breath caught. His hand gripped the desk, then slowly released. The door clicked shut. The sound of the lock engaging was a clean cut between two worlds. Miriam lowered her gaze. Victor didn't look back, but his eyes narrowed slightly, as if he'd just witnessed something irreversible. The hallway was long, the carpet thick enough to swallow her footsteps. The elevator opened. Rebecca stepped inside alone, her pale face reflected in the polished steel. Downstairs, drizzle was starting to speckle the glass canopy. No one saw her off. No one called her name. She walked straight out, gripping her bag strap like it was the last solid thing she had left. The parking lot shimmered with puddles, reflecting streaks of neon from the overhang above. Rebecca stood beneath the edge of the roof, letting a few raindrops fall onto the back of her hand to stay awake. She opened her palm. The employee badge she'd just removed lay there, the scratched plastic catching the light, casting a faint blue glow, the same cold hue that filled the glass room where Victor liked to stand, the light of machines, of decisions stripped of humanity. She closed her hand and slipped the badge into her bag. Her heartbeat was steady, low. Somewhere nearby, a car engine started. The gate opened with a soundless yawn, and the road ahead stretched long, exactly as long as the trust that had just been extinguished. The door to her apartment clicked shut with a thin sound. Rebecca leaned back against it, rainwater dripping from her hair down her neck. She set her bag down, pulled out her Reed Industries badge, scratched, rain-soaked, and placed it on the table. Water pooled beneath it, catching the faint yellow glow of the lamp. The TV was still on. The anchor's voice was calm, detached. Reed Industries' stock continues to fall following a confidential data leak. CEO Michael Reed declined to comment. The screen flickered. Michael at a press conference, then a blurry, overexposed shot of Rebecca, snapped in a restaurant weeks ago. She turned off the TV. The room sank into silence, broken only by the drip from her wet pant cuff hitting the floor. She sat on the bed, hands clutching her head. They've killed my name. With just one email. The wind slipped through the doorframe, carrying the damp scent of rain-soaked streets. The kettle light glowed red, like a sleepless eye. Rebecca picked up her phone and scrolled to Miriam's contact. 3 rings. Then a stranger's voice answered, "Communications office. She's unavailable, and my advice, don't call again." The dial tone returned. She hung up, stared at the darkening screen, then stood and wrung out her damp coat. The sound of dripping mixed with the uneven rhythm of her heartbeat. On the table, her employee ID glimmered like an old toy, the thing she'd once traded her faith to earn. Knock. Knock. 2 soft measured taps. She looked through the peephole. Owen Kareem, same faded hoodie, frayed backpack strap, holding a paper bag of bread and a silver laptop. She opened the door. Owen handed her the bag first, as if it were his admission ticket. "I heard what happened," he said quietly, eyes scanning the room. "I can help." Rebecca shook her head. "No one can." They all believe the lie. Owen sat down and opened his laptop. "If they believe a lie, all we have to do is prove that lie wasn't smart enough." She looked at him, torn between doubt and exhaustion. "Who are you? Why are you helping me?" Owen opened the paper bag and handed her a roll. "I used to fix the printers on the 12th floor, where you worked. You always left a cup of cold mint tea on the counter." Rebecca froze. "And I'm Fatima's son, the janitor from your old restaurant. She once told me, if you ever see that woman in trouble, help her. She lives right." Owen lowered his gaze. "I was fired 8 months ago. I've got nothing left to lose, except letting people think I'm a coward." He asked, "Do you still have a copy of your old inbox?" Rebecca pulled a silver USB stick from the drawer. "I kept it, but no one trusts data that comes from me." Owen plugged it in. The monitor cast a faint blue glow across his face. "I don't need anyone to believe you," he said. "I just need you to believe yourself again." Rebecca watched the reflection of that light in Owen's eyes, saw in it a flicker of courage she thought was gone. Outside, the rain fell steady, like a heart restarting. He typed fast. "We'll trace the header, the path of the email." Lines of code flashed across the screen. There. An internal IP slipped in before the message was sent. "Belongs to the finance floor, Victor Kane's area." Rebecca whispered, "It's him." "Not enough," Owen said. "We need the full chain, IP, timestamp, device, camera. You go into battle, you don't let your hands shake." Rebecca straightened. "They won't." He kept typing. I can recover the log, but you'll need to get the camera footage yourself. Only insiders have access, Miriam, Rebecca said, then shook her head. She's not on my side anymore. Then who still is? The room went silent. Rebecca brewed tea. The scent of mint drifted softly. She set a cup before Owen, then opened an old wooden box. A photo of her father, his hand resting on the shoulder of a 16-year-old girl. His voice echoed in her memory. Justice doesn't need to be recognized. It only needs someone unafraid to tell the truth. She nodded slightly, dried her hands, and sat beside Owen. All right, I won't stay silent anymore. The plan. I'll email Michael. Ask for 10 minutes to face Victor directly. If he still fires me, I disappear. If not, we move forward. Owen nodded. I'll wipe every trace. No one needs to know what we saw. They just need to see Rebecca opened a note and typed header arrow IP arrow timestamp arrow device arrow camera. The words lined up, steady and sharp. She drafted a short email to Michael. No pleading, no defense, just one request. Outside, the rain had stopped. The noodle shop downstairs murmured faintly through the night air. She took a sip of mint tea. The light bitterness slid down her throat like a silent vow. She pressed send. Owen kept working, the blue glow of the screen gleaming off his glasses, like fragments of truth pulled from the dark. Rebecca turned off the overhead light. The room was bathed only in that pale blue, casting over her face, no longer afraid, now cool and resolute, like steel. On the table, her employee ID had finally dried. The scratch along its edge caught a sliver of light, thin as a blade, and this time the blade was in her hands. 2 a.m. The cursor blinked on the last line. Rebecca reread the message, deleted one adjective, and left the ending intact. I can prove my innocence. Give me 10 minutes to confront Victor. If I'm wrong, I'll leave forever. She hit send. The screen went blank. No reply, no read receipt. Outside, the post-rain street dried fast. A draft slipped through the window frame, curling damp air around the curtains. Dawn was near, but the light still felt out of reach. Rebecca closed the laptop and counted 10 slow beats. When she opened her eyes, Owen was still bent over the screen. The log lines pulsed like a racing heart. Anything else? She asked. Yes, Owen said, eyes fixed on the code. There's an access log from an unknown device, 3 minutes before the email went out. IPs from the finance floor, Victor's zone. If we get the hallway camera, the chain will be complete. Rebecca nodded. I'll handle that. On the 48th floor, Michael Reed hadn't slept. The room was still as glass. Only the ticking of the clock filled the air. His phone lit up, a message from Rebecca Carter. He froze. His finger hovered over the screen, not touching, just reading. I can prove my innocence. Each word struck the void he thought he'd sealed. Part of him wanted to respond. Another, colder part, whispered, Don't be a fool. She betrayed you. Michael set the phone down and walked to the glass wall. The city lights were fading into dawn, yet her gaze, steady, unbegging, burned clearly in his mind. The phone still glowed. The message remained unopened. Early morning. The parking lot beneath Reed Tower was veiled in mist. Michael had just stepped out of the elevator, his secretary trailing behind. He was about to get into the car when he stopped. Rebecca was standing there. No coat, just a pale blazer, hair tied neatly back. Her face was pale from the cold, but her eyes didn't waver. A few feet behind her, Owen stood with a crossbody backpack, like someone seeing another off. Sir, shall I call security? The secretary whispered. Michael didn't answer. He only looked at Rebecca. She stepped closer, stopping 3 paces away. I know you don't trust me. But I only need 10 minutes in this morning's meeting with Victor. I have proof." He remained silent. "If I'm wrong," she continued, "I'll leave. For good. I promise." The air was thick as the fog. Michael lowered his head for half a second, his voice low. 10 minutes. Just 10. Rebecca nodded. Owen exhaled softly, his shoulders loosening. When Michael turned away, his eyes lingered briefly on the two of them standing together. Something small and strange slipped through the layer of coldness. Not jealousy, but the quiet threat of a trust returning from the dead. The meeting room door opened. The air smelled of coffee and freshly printed paper. Michael sat at the head of the table. To his right was Victor Kane. Dark tie, crisp collar. On the large screen, the cost breakdown was neatly displayed, as if everything lay perfectly within his control. Rebecca entered. Her heels sank soundlessly into the carpet. She set down her laptop, plugged in a USB, and spoke calmly. "This is a copy of the server log. Please look at the header section." On the screen, the header lines enlarged, IP ranges, timestamps, original encryption layers, clear and sharp as a knife's edge. Michael squinted. "What do you know about this account, Victor?" "Forgery, sir," Victor replied instantly. "Headers can be faked. Any average technician could do it." Rebecca didn't respond. She just switched slides. 2 IP addresses appeared side by side, one from her computer, one from the sender's device. The addresses don't match. The sender's device was on the 15th floor, not the 28th, where I work. "You're deflecting," Victor interrupted. "You could be an accomplice." An employee recently terminated suddenly has evidence of innocence. How convenient. Michael turned toward him. His gaze sharpened. "You're saying she had help?" "Obviously. Who gave her access to the internal logs? Outsiders can't get in." The room fell silent. Then a calm, deep voice came from the back. "You're right." All eyes turned. Owen leaned against the wall, hands in his coat pockets. "Outsiders can't, unless an insider leaves the gate open." Victor's face froze. "Who the hell are you?" "The guy who fixed the security hole you created," Owen replied, stepping forward. "Former system engineer of this building, and the one who just restored the original log from the Geneva server you thought you erased." He placed another USB on the table. "This contains the access audit trail. admin.vk, dash your biometric fingerprint match the login." "Not hers." A murmur rippled through the room, then faded. Victor's face drained of color, yet he forced a smile. "Fabricated. You two staged this." Michael turned to Rebecca. "You once said," she began slowly, "people believe lies easily when they come from a familiar voice. Today, I'm just showing you whose voice that really was." She played the final video clip. A secondary camera angle, bright enough to show Victor plugging a USB into a workstation on the 15th floor. The indicator light blinked 3 times, then steadied. Reflected in the glass behind him, his ID badge, Victor Kane. No one breathed. Miriam dropped her pen. The sound hitting the table was like a cut through the air. Victor turned to Michael, his voice cracking. You can't believe her. I've stood by you for 10 years. "That's exactly why," Michael interrupted. "This disappoints me." Victor froze, eyes hollowing. Michael leaned back, fingers interlaced. "I don't yet know if you're innocent, Rebecca. But what you just did, I'll remember." Rebecca replied quietly, "I don't need to be remembered. I just need to be heard." At the head of the table, Michael stared straight at Victor. His silence now had shape, and Rebecca, for the first time since walking in, allowed her shoulders to loosen, ready to stand 10 more minutes if needed. The close-up of the inserted USB still filled the big screen. The light blinked 3 times, then held steady, as if every excuse had just gone still with it. Nobody moved. The ceiling fan hummed evenly, ticking like a clock against everyone's last nerve. After 10 long seconds, Michael Reed spoke softly but clearly. Security. The door opened. 2 guards in black entered, moving as quietly as shadows. Victor Kane took a step back, lips dry, tugging his tie straight, as if tidiness could still restore his image. "You can't do this to me," he burst out, his voice breaking into a shout. "I helped you build this entire empire." Michael didn't stand. Through the white glare of the screen, his tone was icy. "And you almost destroyed it with a single click." Victor swung his arm, hitting the edge of a water glass. The liquid spread across the table in a thin line. The guards grabbed his arms. He turned to Michael, eyes red. "I just wanted you to see she's not trustworthy. She'll betray you soon enough. All of them will." Michael rose, the chair gliding softly over the carpet. His voice dropped low. "No, Victor. She betrayed your silence, the one that's corroded honor in this place, for far too long." The guards escorted Victor out. The sound of his shoes brushing the carpet was brief. The door shut with a metallic thud and faded. The screen returned to standby, reflecting faces still frozen mid-shock. The room felt half empty, though every seat was filled. Rebecca stood at the presentation spot, holding the USB like a pen. She didn't cry. She just breathed slowly, letting her heartbeat settle. The cold sweat on her neck began to dry. Michael looked at her. No more blade in his eyes, only the muted clarity of a man recognizing his own fault. "I was wrong," he said plainly. "Not just about you, but about myself." Rebecca slipped the USB into her pocket. "Honor isn't lost through a mistake," she said softly. "It's lost when someone refuses to face it." Michael nodded slowly. The corners of his eyes glistened, not from weakness, but from finally setting down something he'd carried too long. Miriam put down her pen and leaned back in her chair, as if released from a long-held breath. The others quietly gathered their papers, careful not to disturb the silence forming between the two. Michael pressed the intercom button. "Miriam, come in." She stepped forward, standing slightly to the side so she wouldn't block Rebecca's view. Michael spoke, each word deliberate. "Ms. Carter's access and position are fully reinstated. Starting today, she'll lead the Culture and Communications team for the European project." Rebecca shook her head immediately. "I don't want the title. I just want to make sure no one else goes through what I did." Michael looked at her for a moment, then agreed to the only condition that could turn him around. "Then teach me how to do that." Miriam allowed herself a faint smile, a smile not meant for the press, but for this room, which had just learned a new word. Michael turned to legal. "Draft an independent internal complaint process. Every anonymous report must go through 2 verification paths. Until I say otherwise, security will report directly to me." He paused, glancing back at Rebecca. "You'll review every document. Write it in human language. I'll make it shorter and clearer," she replied. That night, the city stayed lit later than usual. On the rooftop, the wind had softened. Below, the streets shimmered like a river of steel. Michael and Rebecca stood by the railing. On the small wooden table sat a steaming pot of mint tea. No secretaries, no recorders. Only the sound of the flag brushing against its pole now and then. Michael poured tea and set a cup in front of Rebecca. He spoke quietly. "I used to think power was what made people silent. Now I know. It only makes us lonely." Rebecca took the cup. The warmth pushed back the chill of the night. And sometimes one voice telling the truth is the only thing that can save an entire system. Michael leaned on the railing, both hands gripping the edge. "I've paid for silence for years. Tonight, I'll pay my debt to a voice She didn't say, "Thank you." She just sipped her tea, breathing in the scent of mint and smoke. They stood in silence for a long time, a silence that no longer threatened, but healed. "Tomorrow morning," Michael said, almost like a note to himself, "we'll announce the internal investigation. I'll make a public apology." Rebecca nodded. "Don't blame the system. Take responsibility. People believe in a company when those inside are treated right." Michael glanced at her, a small curve forming at the corner of his lips. A rare expression for him. "You speak, I listen." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of late rain. Down the service stairs, a guard's footsteps echoed once and faded. Above them, the company flag fluttered, half catching the city's light, half swallowed by shadow. A soft gust blew through, folding the fabric, then letting it unfurl again, whispering against the dark sky, half light, half night, like Michael himself, taking his first step out of his own darkness. The same mint teapot was later placed on the conference table, steam still faintly rising. Morning light filtered through the blinds, scattering across messy stacks of papers. The room was empty. A tilted chair, a fallen pen, a cold glass of water still marked by a lip print. Michael Reed sat alone, jacket unbuttoned, wrist bare. He touched the rim of the glass, as if testing the temperature of a new day. A soft knock. Miriam entered, holding a folder already clipped and ready. "The board is waiting for your formal decision to terminate Victor." Michael didn't look at the papers. His eyes lingered on the halo of light on the desk. "Do it. And send her a public apology." His voice was low, tired, but steady. Miriam nodded, typed a few quick lines on her phone, and hit send. As she turned to leave, Michael called after her. "Miriam?" She stopped. "Don't polish the apology to sound better. Let me say exactly what I did wrong." Miriam paused for a beat, then smiled softly. "Yes, sir." By afternoon, the sky had cleared after 2 days of rain. Rebecca sat by the window of her small apartment, next to a pot of mint. Miriam arrived and handed her an envelope stamped with the Reed Industries logo. Rebecca opened it and read slowly. "Reinstatement. Compensation. A signed apology." She folded it neatly and set it down. "I don't need their apology on paper." Miriam pulled out a chair, sitting slightly angled to let the light through. "Then what do you need?" "A reason to believe they'll be different," Rebecca said, not forcefully, just like a nail driven into the right spot on the wall. Miriam nodded. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Empty office. He wants to see you." The next morning, the hallway was quiet. The door opened. Michael stood by the window, hands in his pockets, posture straighter than the night before. Rebecca stepped in, closing the door behind her. The air was so clear she could hear the rustle of her sleeve. Michael spoke without turning. "I used to think I understood the language of power, but I forgot how to speak to people." Rebecca moved closer to the desk, tracing the edge of the glass. "That language isn't lost. It just needs to be spoken with truth." Michael turned, eyes steady. "I want you to come back, not to work for me, but to work with me, to fix what's broken." Rebecca didn't answer right away. She glanced around the room, the same table, the same light, but something in the air was different. "Fixing is a hard word," she said, "but we can start." Michael pulled out a chair and opened a slim proposal. On the cover, Community Culture and Education Fund. "You saved my reputation," he said simply. "Now help me save those who have no voice." This fund will offer language scholarships, protect corporate whistleblowers, and finance translation of medical and legal documents for immigrant communities. You'll be its first director. Rebecca flipped through the pages quickly, scanning the budget, bylaws, oversight clauses. "If you truly believe in this, start by listening to them. Don't hold meetings in glass rooms. Go where they live. Michael nodded instantly, as if he'd been waiting for that. And I want to start by listening to you, about the process, the language, the things I've never seen. Rebecca closed the file and slid it back toward him. Then we'll walk together, but I need a handwritten pledge on 3 principles. Whistleblowers must be independently protected. Apologies must come from those at fault, and power must never be justified by efficiency. Michael pulled a blank sheet, took a pen, and began to write slowly, by hand, without a secretary. The ink dried across neat, deliberate lines. The press room had been set up in a rush. Microphones gathered like a bouquet, cameras circled like watchful eyes. Michael stepped onto the podium. No watch, no notes. Rebecca sat in the front row beside Miriam. After a brief introduction, silence fell. He looked straight into the cameras. Those who are wrongly accused deserve not only justice, but respect. Last week, I doubted the wrong person and trusted the wrong evidence. I apologize to Ms. Rebecca Carter and take full responsibility for the system that failed her. A wave of flashes lit the room. We will release the internal report, press charges against those who violated protocols, and establish the Community Culture and Education Fund, led by Miss Carter, to protect the voices too often ignored. This isn't charity, it's duty. When asked why he spoke without notes, Michael simply said, "Because this is something I needed to say myself." In that light, Rebecca saw no arrogance, only truth, stripped bare. The conference ended. Reporters rushed for the exits, leaving behind the warm scent of cables and plastic. Michael stepped down, crossed the crowd, and stopped in front of Rebecca. He didn't offer his hand. He just said quietly, "Thank you for teaching me what no advisor ever could." That single line closed one chapter and opened another, where listening became a new form of power. 3 months later, dawn spread over the Rub al Khali desert. Rebecca stepped from a pickup, her shoes sinking into the sand. Before her stretched rows of workers raising solar panels beneath the rising sun. A handwritten sign read, "Light Project, Reed Industries." Michael waited nearby, shirt sleeves rolled, no bodyguards. "You're just in time for the first switch," he said. On a small wooden platform, he spoke to the crowd. True power doesn't belong to those who are heard, but to those who listen. And today, I choose the latter. Applause rippled through the desert air. Later, as they sat beneath the shade of a container sharing mint tea, he asked, "If there's one thing you'd change about me, what would it be?" Rebecca smiled. "Don't ask others. Ask yourself each time you fall silent." He nodded. "I'm learning that." Every day before leaving, he took from his pocket an old plastic badge, her employee card, once taken from her. "I kept it," he said, "not to remind me of your mistake, but of mine." She shook her head gently. "You can let it go now." The past has taught us enough. Michael tossed the badge into the sand, where the wind carried it away. Moments later, the countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The switch flipped, the panels flickered alive, and light spread across the desert like an awakening. Michael whispered, "When you said, 'Let me,' I thought it was permission. Now I know. It was the beginning." Rebecca looked toward the horizon. Every true beginning starts when someone dares to speak what they believe. They stood together, watching the panels glow blue under the evening sky. A group of women passed with trays of dates. Rebecca broke one in half and handed it to him. He took a bite slowly, as if memorizing the sweetness after the applause faded. The circle had closed. From a fallen spoon and the words, "Let me," in a crowded hall, to this quiet field of light, where truth no longer needed permission to be heard. Rebecca hadn't won through noise, but through precision. The calm courage of someone who knows every word has weight. And Michael hadn't changed through a single apology, but by standing still before the truth and repairing piece by piece what power had broken. Honor doesn't die from mistakes, it dies when we deny them. Justice isn't born from slogans, but from small, steady acts, repeated until trust can stand on its own. Perhaps what remains isn't about who won or lost, but the growth of both sides, the one who dared to speak up, and the one who learned to listen. Language, after all, is more than words. It's the bridge between misunderstanding and respect. If you've ever stood before a closed door, uncertain of what to say, remember this. Speaking the truth at the right moment can open it. And if you hold the power to decide, sometimes the most important question is the simplest one. Whose voice should I hear first? Have you ever been in Rebecca's place, hesitating before saying something that truly mattered? Or in Michael's, standing on the edge of an apology that needed to be spoken? Tell me what you'd do differently starting tomorrow. If this story touched you, leave a comment, share it with someone who might need it, and follow so you won't miss the next journey.